Forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers, and I hardly know what to say. I am from the fields, you know, and while quite at home with the dandelion, I am a sorry figure in the drawing room. This is my introduction. My name is Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, but I'm sure you know me best by the names they call me in the town of Amherst, Massachusetts, where I live. They call me Mr. Dickinson's half-crazy daughter. They say I am at the peak, the pinnacle of all the family oddity. They call me the nun of poetry, the queen recluse. Some people call me the myth of Amherst because of my habit of running away. Do you know what I do when someone comes to the house? I run upstairs, and there at the top of the stairs, I can hear what is being said down below. But no one ever sees me. Do you know what I do to entertain the children of the village? I gather a loaf of gingerbread from the kitchen. I find a basket with a handle. I put the loaf of gingerbread in the basket. I tie a rope to the handle, and I go upstairs to my room. I open the door, and I lower the basket of gingerbread out the window to the children waiting down below, so they can enjoy something sweet from the kitchen. But they never, ever see me. It is true, I never leave my father's house for any town or grounds, except once. Once I crept out by moonlight to view a church that was being built across the way. Otherwise, I stay only at home, reading my books, writing my poems, and being alone with my thoughts. Some people call me the moth of Amherst because of my custom of wearing only white. I have worn no other color now for many years. Wearing only white, never seeing anyone. Is such a life madness, do you think? Much madness is divinest sense, much sense the starkest madness. Assent, be agreeable, and you are sane. But demur, say no, you're straight away dangerous and handled with a chain. Not long ago, my little niece, Mattie, who was about 9, she lives next door with my brother Austin, his wife Susan, and his sister and brother. Little Mattie came next door to the house, and I invited her upstairs to my room. I showed her inside my desk for writing, my narrow bed, my books, and my papers. And I closed the door behind us, and I pointed to that empty room, to that solitude and silence, and I said, Mattie, this is freedom. This is freedom, Mattie, this solitude. Is not the imagination the most glorious place to dwell? Why go into the world when all the world is inside us? Those who look there will see it. How do people live without any thoughts? You must have seen them on the street. How do they live? How do they live? How do people get the strength to put their clothes on in the morning when they're always talking and talking and talking? There is not so much life as talk of life. I need silence. I need silence like a spacious bird. People ask of my companions. Why, they are the hills and the sundown and a dog as large as myself that my father bought for me. Dogs, you know, are better than humans because they know everything, but they never tell. I think a dog is the most glorious work of art, far superior to any painting or any statuary or even the most vivid garden. I hope, if I get to heaven someday, that the first to greet me there will be my dog Carlo. But perhaps some of you are like my sister Lavinia, who loves cats. Do some of you prefer the company of cats to dogs? I call cats those little assassins. The only cat I like is a cat disappearing around the corner with a rat's tail in his mouth. That is a useful cat. My sister Lavinia loves cats, and I love her. She is my only sister, younger, and like me, she has never married. We live in our father's house in Amherst, a fine brick house on Main Street, and the family I come from is rather refined. My grandfather founded Amherst College. My father and brother are lawyers. But there are a great many Dickinsons in Amherst, and not all of them are my relatives. It has been said that the Dickinsons are so numerous in Amherst that they choke out all other forms of vegetation. My little sister Lavinia, she says of me, Emily has to think. She is the only one in the family who has to do so. Lavinia is the caretaker in the family. She is the one who's always dusting stairs and looking for a lost glove or such. Vinny is busier than the presidential candidates, and in more important ways. For they have only the care of the Union, and Vinny seems to need to care for the entire universe. I may be the thinker in the family. Lavinia is not the thinker. She is the sort of person who believes that Vermont is in Asia. Vinny tells stories about me, and she laughs about what she calls my wicked ways of running away from people. You realize, of course, that it was not always possible for me to run away, and up until I was 30, I lived in general society. I went about just as you do. It was only at age 30 or so that I began to withdraw from the world completely. It was in those younger, earlier years when I had to endure visitors in the house. Do you enjoy having company in the house? There is always the need to have the house neat and tidy. Have you noticed that? I prefer pestilence myself. And there's all that cooking and fussing. There is a kitchen in my house, but I hope I never find it. Aunt Libby, when she came to the house to visit, she liked things very neat, very orderly. And it was also annoying to me that when we had visitors, well, there's always the need to look pleasant and agreeable, even when you do not feel so. Have you noticed that? Aunt Libby demanded that things be orderly in the house, so orderly that I began that when she passed by, the trees were ordered to stand more upright. And I worried that she would starch the geraniums to make them stand stiff. I called her the only male relative on the female side of the family. Aunt Libby also fancied herself to be something of a poet. Once, at a family gathering, she recited a poem she had written, a 50-stanza poem on the subject of my brother Austin's toothache. I was fortunate to have been spared that event. Lavinia also tells stories about other ways in which she considers me wicked. There is the matter of going to church, which I gave up doing many years ago in the traditional way. But in my own way, I do go to church. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home. Lavinia also tells a story about a time when I was home alone. I was working in my room, writing, and there was a knock at the door, a persistent knock at the door. I, being the only one available to go downstairs, was forced to go downstairs. And there, on the doorstep, was an elderly and very talkative old woman. I was so annoyed at being interrupted, I sent her to the cemetery to save her the expense of moving there. Lavinia also tells tales about visits from Dr. Bigelow. Dr. Bigelow comes to the house if I am ill. Lavinia brings him upstairs and seats him in my room. And I simply walk past the doorway, fully clothed, expecting Dr. Bigelow to make his diagnosis simply by seeing me pass by. Dr. Bigelow says the only illness that he can diagnose simply by seeing someone pass by is the mumps. You must think from what I am telling you that I have no friends at all. But I do. I have many friends, 92 friends with whom I correspond on a regular basis, sharing news, sharing ideas, people I write to. I write letters to the world that never wrote to me. I consider a letter like immortality because it is the mind alone without the body. I have also said that words are my dearest companions. Sometimes my own words so chill and burn me, I can hardly stand it. A word is dead when it is said, some say. But I say it just begins to live that day. And words in books. Oh, for the first time when I saw a book, I said, and so this is a book. Then there must be more of them. What glory. There is no ship capable of taking us as far away as a book to lands unknown. How glorious. But there are two special friendships that I wish to tell you about tonight. The first is a friendship that is the subject of much gossip and much speculation. Some people have said that my strange ways come about from a disappointment in love. There are rumors about me and a certain man named Reverend Charles Wadsworth. When I was a younger woman and I went about society, I went to Philadelphia to visit with my cousins there. They took me to their church, the Arch Street Presbyterian Church. And there, at that church, I heard a powerful minister speak, a great man, I recognized immediately a kinship between us. I call him my dearest earthly friend, my Eden. I will admit to you that Reverend Wadsworth and I have sent letters forth to one another, sometimes in secret, though we have only seen each other twice in 20 years. He is so busy being a great and powerful minister and being someone else's husband besides. I cannot live with him. It would be life, and life is over there upon the shelf. I cannot die with him, for one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. And so, we must live apart, he there and I here, with just the door ajar, as oceans are, and prayer, and that pale sustenance. Despair. There is another important friendship in my life. A friendship with a man that I consider my teacher, my mentor, or my preceptor. His name is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Now, you may know Mr. Higginson from his work in the abolitionist movement. He was one of the secret six that helped to finance John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And he led one of the only Negro regiments in the Civil War. But it was not in that capacity that I knew Mr. Higginson. You see, in April of 1862, I was reading the Atlantic magazine. In it, there was an article by Mr. Higginson. It was called Letter to a Young Contributor. And in that article, Mr. Higginson invited poets who had not published work to consider sending him a few poems with the possibility that they might be published. I did something very bold, very brave. I, a completely unknown poet, I sent Mr. Higginson 4 poems. And I said, Mr. Higginson, would you read my poems? Would you tell me if poems are alive? Would you tell me if my poems breathe? I asked him to be my teacher. And I asked if someone could be taught to be a poet at all. I said, can poetry be taught? Or is it nearer than the bone, something inside oneself, the ability that some people have to play the piano or to sing without ever having been given instruction? Is poetry like that, or is it like witchcraft? I said, I will not be noisy, Mr. Higginson. I will not crowd your desk, but please, would you tell me if my poems have merit? Mr. Higginson wrote back. And what do you think he had to say of the poems of Emily Dickinson? Did he admire them? Did he offer to publish them? Did he say they were altogether above heaven and God? No. He said my verse was wayward, like a dog that had run away, I suspect. He said my rhythm, my meter, was spasmodic. He called me uncontrolled. He said that I should not even think of publishing my work. So, I wrote back to Mr. Higginson. I said, thank you for the surgery, it was not so painful as I supposed. Now, do you think that I stopped writing to Mr. Higginson? Do you think I stopped sending him poems? No. No. For many years now, I have continued to write to Mr. Higginson. I send him poems. He sends letters in reply saying that my poems baffle him. But we are good friends nonetheless. Now, I must admit to you that Mr. Higginson and I wrote many letters to one another, but we did not see each other for 7 years. We did not meet face to face. In those 7 years, the time that I was writing him letters, I must admit to you that I lied to Mr. Higginson. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Have you ever lied about yourself? Well, I must be in the company of angels because no one is nodding their head. On the first matter in which I wrote to Mr. Higginson, it concerned a picture of myself. Mr. Higginson, who had never seen me, must have wanted to know if I was every bit as strange in appearance as I seemed to be from my poetry. So he asked if I would send him a picture of myself. I lied. I said there is no picture of myself. But that was not true. When I was 17, my father had insisted that I have my picture made. I was not feeling inclined to have it made that day. Have you ever been in a situation where someone is pointing that camera contraption right at you, asking you to look attractive and happy, and you do not feel that way? And then that is what is captured in the picture. And you think, oh, certainly I am not that unattractive. Well, that is what happened. I was feeling rebellious when my father insisted that I have my picture made. So I put on a very grim expression, and that was what was captured. Naturally, I did not wish Mr. Higginson to see that picture. So I said, no, I have no picture. And then I did what all good writers do. I described myself to him in words. I said, I am small, like the wren, the little brown bird that hops. My hair, I said, is as bold as the chestnut burr, the reddish-brown seed pod on the chestnut tree. I said, my eyes are the color of sherry left in the glass after the guest departs. Now, on the second matter in which I lied to Mr. Higginson, that concerned my education. He wanted to know if I had had a good education, and I said, oh no, I'm just a country girl, I said. But that was not true. You see, I went to high school at Amherst Academy, a very fine school, and then for 1 year, I went away to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, nearby in South Hadley, for 1 year of college. Now, have any of you ever been to Mount Holyoke and seen the buildings there? I understand that they are designed in the manner of an English insane asylum. The perfect place for some 300 of us young ladies, under the very strict authority of Miss Mary Lyon. We began our lessons very early in the morning at 6:30. We had Latin and Greek, and then religion. Religion was of great emphasis at Mount Holyoke. And Mary Lyon expected that all of us girls would profess our religious beliefs with assurance. She developed 3 categories. There was the esteemed, the very hallowed category of the young ladies who had already professed their religious beliefs. There was the category of the girls who were about to profess their religious beliefs. And then there was a category reserved just for me and one other young lady. That was the category of hopeless. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. We also had, under Miss Mary Lyon's instructions, poise and deportment. And I can see by looking at you that you have not had adequate instruction in that matter. Or you have forgotten. It has been a long time since you've had instruction. Mary Lyon would be most displeased if I did not offer you some instruction in poise this evening. We are required to sit with our spines erect, our backs straight, our shoulders back, and our hands neatly folded in our laps. Young ladies must never cross their legs. That is to invite unwanted attention from young gentlemen. Now, I believe you look more poised and refined and intelligent already. Oh, but you are rebellious, my dear. Oh, much better. Much better. There is always one in the crowd. Now, there was a third matter in which I lied to Mr. Higginson, and that concerned my poetry. He wanted to know if I had been writing poems for very long, and I said, no, I've only written a few poems. But that was not true. I had written many hundreds of poems. I put them in a drawer in my room, and apart from a few poems that have been published in the Springfield newspaper, no one knows about my work as a poet. And I suspect that will always be the case. We have come now to the subject of my poetry. You must be curious what those subjects are. I write a great deal about nature. The hummingbird with wings like a revolving wheel. Dew like pearls on the grass. The sea like an everywhere of silver. I describe the sunrise as a bonnet of ribbons that are untied. I'll tell you how the sun rose, a ribbon at a time. The steeples swam in amethyst, the news like squirrels ran. The hills untied their bonnets, the bobolinks begun, and I said softly to myself, that must have been the sun. I write, too, about certain extreme states of emotional tension. A funeral in the brain with mourners to and fro, treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. I have felt my life like a loaded gun. I have felt pain so utter, anguish so utter, it was like being swallowed up and then dropped into a cauldron, bone by bone by bone. I write often about immortality, about death. I call it my flood subject, the subject that I keep returning to again and again and again because it haunts me. What is there in the great blue skies of the beyond of which we know nothing? I imagine death as a man in a poem, a figure in a carriage driver like a suitor that comes on a day when I am busy, when I have no awareness that the carriage driver is approaching. But he comes, and he takes me regardless. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. I know that figure of death well. Death has visited us of late, and the dying has been deep in the Dickinson family. My brother Austin lives next door, and his little son, Gilbert, age 9, fell ill with typhoid fever. I, who never leave the house, went next door to be with Gilbert, to be with him as he lay dying. And in his last moments, with his final breath, he lifted his head from the pillow and he called out, "Open the door, open the door. They are waiting for me." Who were waiting for him? All we possess, we would give to know. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart wonders. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, and then the letting go. I have gone so far in a poem as to imagine my own death. It is a time when the room is filled not with the golden light or the sound of angels, but with the sound of a common, ordinary house. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness between the waves of storm. Then there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Well, my friends, I have told you a great number of secrets. And before you run away to your family, to your village, and before I run away, before you tell your friends and family about this visit tonight with the strange creature, Emily Dickinson, I would like to offer you some time to interrogate me. Do you have any questions for me, Miss Emily Dickinson? I cannot promise to tell you the truth, of course. In a poem, I say, tell all the truth, but tell it slant.
When did you lose your mother?
Well, my mother is very much alive, but Mother has been ill for almost 20 years. So I suppose I never really had a mother, if a mother is someone you run to when you are troubled. Have I drained power completely?
Dickinson, did you share any of your poetry with Charles Wordsworth?
Charles Wadsworth. No, I'm afraid not. No, we are distanced He put a belt around my life. I heard the buckle snap. He turned away, imperious. My lifetime folded up.
How long do you spend working on your poems? Sometimes they just completely flow automatically, or do you labor many hours?
The answer is yes to both questions. Sometimes they arise spontaneously, and among my papers are recipes with poems scribbled on the backs, or envelopes with poems scribbled on the backs. And then others go through many revisions, and there are groups of papers with the same poem written and rewritten again and again.
Have you experienced any regret at your isolation?
No. I consider my life the perfected life. You know how a carpenter very carefully builds a house. That is how I have constructed my life. The props assist the house until the house is built. And then the props withdraw, and adequate, erect, the house supports itself. Just such a retrospect has the perfected life. A past of plank and nail, and then slowly it stands alone. The scaffolds drop. That is my life, the perfected life.
Can you talk about why you decided to do a life?
I must leave that question, the answer to that, to mystery, that deep, dark stranger, I call him.
How long have you had the habit of running away?
Well, my family said that my inclination happened gradually. They said it was only a happen. My mother was ill. I was needed at home. I was devoted to my writing. My sister Lavinia was all too eager to go into the village and do the family errands and such, so it just became my preferred way of life. There was no date on which I made that decision. It was a gradual withdrawal. Well, I see I have drained your nerve power completely now. Even a small weight like myself is tiresome upon a weary rope. I fear my story fatigues you. Not completely?
I've read some of your poems about immortality. You may be using that word in a different way than I would use it. You describe what you mean by immortality.
What do I mean by immortality? Well, it is the question of what happens when we die. What goes on beyond that? I believe that we are in some way cherished by our Maker. But beyond that, all is silence. It's a question that I probe again and again. It is like a loose tooth that you can't stop toying with, that question of what happens when we die. That is the most sufficient answer I can give. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that, it is time for me to bid you goodbye. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Deborah Connor, and I think have been introduced a little bit. I will tell you I am from South Carolina, and this is my 4th winter Chautauqua here. You're going to have to get me a house before long if I keep coming back. I will also be here for summer Chautauqua, and that'll be my 2nd visit for that tour. My job now is to talk to you as myself and to answer some questions as myself that Emily could not have answered for you. So let's see if there are some of those questions out there. Yes? Who else in Emily's lifetime died besides her nephew? Only her nephew. Her mother was ill for many years. She was one of those people who seemed to be on for 20 years, but in fact, she died a few years before Emily herself died. Oh, yes, I'm incorrect in that. Her father had also died years before Emily died. Well, let me give you the dates in which she lived. She lived from 1830 to 1886. She was 55 years old when she died, and she died of kidney disease. She probably had undiagnosed hypertension. There was no way to treat high blood pressure in those days, so it's believed that was ultimately the cause of it.
What's your favorite poem of Emily Dickinson?
My favorite poem is one that I recited a bit of for you tonight, and that is, "After great pain, a formal feeling comes." I love those last lines where she compares anguish to the feeling of freezing to death. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Those are perfect lines, perfect lines.
Did she know how much money she made? I mean, how much her poems made? Did they make much money for her?
Oh, well, let's talk about how Emily came to be published. If you were here in my workshop today, you know the rather scandalous story that has to do with Emily Dickinson's path to publication. I'll give you a shortened version of that. When Emily Dickinson died, her sister, Lavinia, found in her bedroom a drawer full of poems. Over Emily's lifetime, she wrote 1,789 poems. Wow, is right. So Emily had given her sister instructions to burn all of her letters. All of the letters that were in Emily's possession were to be burned. However, Lavinia, the sister, couldn't bring herself to destroy the poems. So Lavinia began looking at the poems. She began to think, oh, well, maybe these should be published. Maybe these have merit. So she took the poems to her sister-in-law. Austin's family, Austin and his wife, lived right next door. So Lavinia took a group of poems to her sister-in-law, Sue, and said, "Sue, would you help me get these poems in some kind of publishable shape?" And Sue said, yes. However, maybe you've had the experience of having someone agree to help you on a project and then they don't do anything. Well, that's really what happened with Sue. And keep in mind, it was an enormous project. There were poems in all sorts of disarray, of different versions. Emily's handwriting was difficult to read. So Sue worked on them sort of half-heartedly and then gave up. Okay, so Emily's sister, Lavinia, then gathers up a group of poems and she goes to another woman and asks for help. That other woman was literally the other woman in her brother's life. It was a woman with whom her brother was having an affair. Her name was Mabel Loomis Todd. Mabel Loomis Todd was married. She was 27 years younger than Austin Dickinson. But she was a very dynamic, very driven, very creative, and very charismatic woman. And she worked tirelessly over years to get Emily's poems into publishable condition. So she got them published, but you can imagine how the family felt when out of Emily Dickinson's poems and edited by Mabel Loomis Todd. So still, that debate over who has rights to Emily's poems still rages. If it weren't for Mabel Loomis Todd, the poems would probably never have seen publication. But on the other hand, the Dickinson family says, wait a minute, she was our Emily. And keep in mind that Mabel Loomis Todd, after she gets the poems published, she goes on the road as the Emily Dickinson expert. She gives lectures, talks, she signs books and all that sort of thing as the Emily Dickinson scholar. She never met Emily Dickinson. So, again, there's hard feelings. And some of the Dickinson papers are at Harvard, some of them are at Amherst. There was some conflict over the houses. So it's just really kind of a big old mess still.
Do we know anything about her capitalization choices within the poems? Because it seems unconventional today, but was it unconventional at the time?
Yes, the poems, the way they look on the page are unusual. She capitalized nouns, for example. She used lots of dashes. But there's many theories about that. But, in the end, I think you just have to say that was her way of composing a poem. If you're a PhD candidate, they actually study the length of the dash in the poem to see, if that has some sort of meaning. A little longer dash means something different than a little shorter dash. I don't know. Anything else? Okay.
Do you have knowledge of the people that she wrote all these letters to? What types of people were they?
She wrote letters indiscriminately to people who knew people that she knew. She wrote a lot to acquaintances. She just liked to write letters. When I first started performing as Emily Dickinson in 1997, and I told audiences, particularly kids, that Emily wrote 5 or 6 letters a day, they thought, oh my gosh, who would ever do that? That has so totally changed now, because we're all essentially writing letters to one another. 5 or 6 letters a day, well, that doesn't seem so strange. Dickinson, over her lifetime, by the way, wrote 10,000 letters. And the tragedy is we don't have the letters that were written to her because her sister burned them. And that leaves lots and lots of mystery in the Dickinson story, including this possible romance that she had with Reverend Charles Wadsworth.
What prompted you to share Emily Dickinson
Oh, there you
nonstop?
What inspired me to become Emily Dickinson? Well, I was in an audience just like you are at a library, and I saw a woman portray Willa Cather. And I thought it was the most fascinating thing that I had ever seen. Not just the in-character portrayal, but the fact that this woman could answer questions as Willa Cather. I just thought that was the amazing part. And I thought, gee, I would really like to do that someday. And because my background is in poetry, Emily Dickinson seemed to be the most likely candidate. So a few years go by, I still think, well, I'd like to do that, but how do you get started? So one snowy day, I got some papers from the National Endowment for the Arts, and they were offering fellowships to people who could create a worthy project in education. And I thought, what chance do I have in living in West Virginia to get a national fellowship? But I thought, it's a snowy day, I'll fill out the papers, and guess what happened? They gave me a check, and then I was committed. I said I wanted to create this portrayal of Dickinson, and from there, the state I was living in launched a living history program, and then I was able to get into other states' programs. So that's how it started. But you have to ask yourself this question. This is your dinner table conversation for tonight or tomorrow. If you were going to be a character, what character would you be? If you were going to stand on stage and portray a character, who would it be? Interesting question. Yes, people saved her letters, And then when her sister and Mabel Loomis Todd began to put together those collections, which were published about 5 years after Emily died, they were able to contact people who had letters and get those letters to make that collection. I'm not sure exactly logistically how they did that, but they did get the letters in their possession that had been in the possession of others.
Was she renowned enough as a poet to take letters at that time?
She was not known as a poet when she died. She was completely unknown as a poet. She had published a few poems in a newspaper, Springfield Republican newspaper, but she was not in any way famous. I don't know, people just saved letters more often than, when I moved a couple years ago, I threw away a whole lot of letters, but it was more customary for people to save their letters then. Yes? What year did the college get her poems? Oh, I don't know. It was Mabel Loomis Todd's daughter who gave poems and other artifacts to Harvard. I would guess it would have been in the 40s, but I can't say that for sure. I can't say that for sure.
Was she just eccentric, or she might have been mentally ill?
Well, that's a very good question. We talked about this in workshops today. Was Dickinson mentally ill? What do you think? Now that you've seen me, you think she's perfectly normal? She was quirky. Let's say that. Some things that she did seemed just a little eccentric. Some things that she did seemed a little more abnormal. She got to the point where she could not address an envelope, a letter, to someone because it was too much contact with the outside world. So she had to have somebody else address an envelope. She couldn't have the dressmaker come and make clothing because she couldn't bear to have somebody, fussing with her. So that's a little more extreme. But regardless, she was a brilliant poet, and many scholars think we make too much of this eccentricity of hers. The other question that goes along with why did she withdraw from the world has to be, why did she wear white? And that's, again, a subject of speculation. Some people think that because she had red hair, she was sensitive to the dye in clothing, and white clothing wouldn't have irritated her skin. Some people say that it was an outward symbol for her, that she became the bride of poetry or the nun of poetry by wearing white. That was her announcement. And other people have said, well, she probably just looked good in white because she had reddish hair. It was flattering. We don't really know.
Throughout history, we have had a lot of intelligent people that have become geniuses in a specific area. So maybe that's why after that she became such a great poet. Because she was so eccentric.
Well, gee, if I thought that I could become a great poet by being eccentric, I'm going to change my ways and get weirder and weirder as the days go on. I don't know. Definitely it got her attention. That's because that kind of legend went along with the poems as they became known. So it's intriguing. In the back?
If you respond to the question my wife was asked about white, tell me about Holyoke. Over 1 year of postgraduate study in Holyoke, what happened?
She got homesick. She went away to school for a year and she became homesick. She said, I never want to leave the blessed portals of my home ever again. Home is my definition of God, is what she said. She liked being home. Anybody think they would like to live at home and not go out? No. You? Or you have a question?
You're saying that she's mentally ill. It sounds like she might have had a
Did she have agoraphobia? Well, that was, again, something we explored in the workshop today. I thought agoraphobia was its own kind of illness. You know, agoraphobia literally means fear of the marketplace. And some people have this pathological condition where they can't go out in public. But a psychiatrist by the name of John McDermott has written extensively about agoraphobia being an offshoot of panic attacks. Okay? This is what he says. A person has a panic attack. They become frightened of having a panic attack in public, and so they withdraw from society. They stop going out because they're afraid they're going to embarrass themselves by having a panic attack. That's his theory. Now, there's a lot of different theories, but I think that's an interesting one. It's certainly one that is entertained widely in the scholarly community. And so it was kind of a revelation to me. Anything else?
She wrote that picture that she stayed within the house, or she didn't go on with the field.
She probably went out in her garden, but keep in mind she had a view from her windows of the hills and the gardens and the street. And I always like this one particular image that comes from a critic by the name of Howard Moss, who compares Whitman's philosophy or way of looking at the world against Dickinson's way of looking at the world. And here is what he says. He says, Whitman held a mirror up to the world and wrote about what was going on out there. Dickinson holds a mirror up to herself and writes about what is going on internally. I think that's a really useful, simple, and important distinction. All right.
Tell us about her death.
Oh, the funeral. Yeah, I usually tell students about this, and it is interesting enough to report to you. Even in her death, Dickinson wanted things done her own way. What color do you think her coffin was? White, yes. Her funeral was conducted in the house. That was typical for the time. It would have been typical because the Dickinsons were prominent people for the coffin to be carried out the front door of the house and to be carried by some important men in the community. It would have been carried out the front door, would have been taken to a horse-drawn hearse, and then that horse-drawn hearse with a procession would have gone to the cemetery, which wasn't too far from the Dickinson house. However, Emily did not want things done that way. She wanted her coffin taken out the back door of the house. She wanted it carried by 6 Irish workmen who worked on the family farm. She wanted it carried in such a way that the head of the coffin was always within view of the homestead. Then she wanted it carried through the open doors of the barn, as though she needed to say goodbye to the animals. And for someone like me who loves animals, I just think that's a wonderful image. The last procession going through the barn doors, and then her coffin was, her body was laid to rest in the cemetery, West Cemetery, which you can still visit in Amherst. Has anybody ever been to the Dickinson home? Okay, yeah. You can visit the cemetery, and you can visit the house where she lived, the homestead. You can visit the house where her brother and sister-in-law lived, which is right next door. That's all part of a museum now. Yes, today in talking about some of the reasons that Dickinson may have withdrawn from the world, one of those theories is that she had epilepsy. In the time in which she lived, epilepsy was considered shameful. People who had epilepsy were kept hidden away. It was seen by some people as being possessed by demons. So Dickinson may have withdrawn because she was epileptic. Again, we don't know. The scholar who puts that theory out there has some evidence. Some of it seems a little far-fetched to me, But anyway, it was not so far-fetched that he couldn't write a book about it and probably make some money off that theory. Yes?
So you spent a lot of time with Emily, you probably know her better than people who knew her. So what's your theory? What was her deal?
You know, my theory about why Emily withdrew is that she just found the work that she wanted to do in her life. It was much easier in that day and time for women to be away from society. It wasn't expected that women engage. Dickinson had the means to stay at home. She had someone to take care of the house. She didn't need to marry in order to have income. I just think she found the work she loved, and she did it to the exclusion of all else.
What are the dates as to when the Reverend went to California and when he quit going out of the house?
Oh, dates. I don't have a head for dates. About the time that the Reverend Wadsworth departed for California, he had been a pastor at a church in Philadelphia, and that's where she met him. And then he took a job in California. At that time in Dickinson's life, she is writing a lot about how emotionally distraught she is. So it's really easy to kind of put those two things together. That also became the time when she was most prolific in her writing. It was like she was on fire. Her emotions were so strong and so intense. So again, it's kind of easy to make that connection, but we really don't know. We really don't know. What was the source of her family wealth? Lawyers. They were lawyers. Yeah. Good money in lawyering, I guess. Maybe we can have somebody speak to that. All right. Well, I'm going to wish you good night. And if you have other questions, please come and talk to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.